And joining me now for an exclusive panel interview is Kurt Volker, former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, and Daniel Fried, former US Ambassador to Poland. And we're waiting with our special panel tonight on Diane Francis. She's a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. But first of all, good evening to you, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Now, Ambassador Fried, I would like to start with you. Are we closer than ever to a peace deal in Ukraine? Or is this simply noise and we're simply back at square one?
Oh, it's probably noise, but not because the Trump administration hasn't been trying, but because Putin is not yet interested in any kind of a peace deal. Still, there is a chance to get something done if President Trump remains committed and if Secretary Rubio keeps pulling things in the right direction. So I wouldn't give up on this process. In fact, I would lean into it. I think the Ukrainians are doing a very good job working with the administration despite the complexities of doing so. And I think that the outline of a possible deal, a ceasefire in place and security for Ukraine, is ready to be discussed, but to become serious, we're going to have to put more pressure on Russia.
Ambassador Volker, good evening. The EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, says, quote, Vladimir Putin cannot achieve his goals on the battlefield, so he will try to negotiate his way there. But is it possible that an exhausted Ukraine, which faces a long, cold winter, is equally desperate to strike a deal just to end the fighting, and that to get there it's willing to make some major concessions?
Well, they're both partly true. I think that the Ukrainians are indeed tired. They would accept a ceasefire in place, even though it would leave Russia occupying 20% of Ukrainian territory. But they would accept a ceasefire in place if they could get that now. The problem, however, is that Vladimir Putin is not prepared to accept a ceasefire at this stage. He wants to keep fighting, and I don't agree that he's going to try to achieve his goals by negotiation. He's going to try to achieve his goals by making maximalist demands and seeing whether he can get the US and Europe to deliver for him, which, of course, I don't think is going to happen. So I think this conflict is going to go on for some time to come.
Ms. Diane Francis, I see you have joined us. Good evening to you, ma'am. Now, European leaders keep repeating the line, no decisions about Europe without Europe. It sounds good, but is it still true, or is Brussels right now still too reliant on Washington and Donald Trump when it comes to defending Ukraine and the continent at large? And it appears we are still having some technical difficulties. So, Ambassador Volker, I'll take the question to you. With European leaders repeating that line, no decisions about Europe without Europe, I mean, is it still true, or is Brussels still relying on Donald Trump?
Well, look, President Trump is just going out there and pushing this button and pushing that button, sending Steve Witkoff here. He meets with Dmitriev. They come up with a proposal. It's a mess. He sends Marco Rubio in to clean it up. Rubio meets with the Ukrainians as well as with European leaders. That now seems to have produced a more acceptable plan. Now, of course, Russia will reject that. So I don't think that Europe is being, I don't think decisions are happening without Europe, but I think Europe has to assert itself. It has to be present. It has to offer things as well as Europe is doing. Europe is doing all of those things. And I think we will end up in the place where Dan Fried was just a minute ago, where the only thing that we haven't done is put pressure on Vladimir Putin. And when we start to actually do that, I think then we might see a ceasefire. And then the question will be, how do we make that ceasefire last? How do we deter future Russian attacks? And Europe is absolutely central to that.
Ambassador Fried, how did this peace plan, which many say was partly translated from Russian, which is widely being regarded as having been cooked up between Moscow and Washington, I mean, how did it even become a point of reference for these negotiations and a blueprint that Kyiv has not been able to dismiss out of hand?
Well, there is a mini furor in Washington today about the transcripts of two conversations. Steve Witkoff's with Yuri Ushakov, and Yuri Ushakov with Kirill Dmitriev. What that shows, what those transcripts show, is that Steve Witkoff was trying to jolly the Russians, encourage them to negotiate, and then the Russians decided to use Witkoff to jam through their own proposal. There was not so much wrong with Steve Witkoff trying to work a channel with the Russians. There was everything wrong with Steve Witkoff not examining the proposal point by point. He should have known that it was internally inconsistent and inconsistent indeed with with President Trump's stated objectives. So that was a problem. But as Kurt Volker said, Marco Rubio cleaned it up on Sunday in Geneva in a remarkable show of leadership and discipline. So that damage has been largely undone. There's a better plan. I haven't seen it, but the Ukrainians regard it as better. I'm prepared to believe them. There's a better plan on the table, and the problem will quickly arise that the Russians have no interest in serious negotiations. And then the test will be, are the Europeans and Americans prepared to push against Russia? Because that's the way you get a deal.
Ambassador Volker, you've been an ambassador to NATO. You've led peace negotiations in Ukraine. Speaking of what Ambassador Freed just mentioned there, this news that Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff coached Russia on how to sell the initial plan to the US president. Donald Trump, of course, has dismissed that as, again, and I quote, a very standard form of negotiation. So as a negotiator, does he have a point? Was Mr. Witkoff's approach perhaps the only way to get Putin's people talking?
Well, I'd say 50%. Again, the part of it that Dan just referenced, where he's kind of jollying the Russians, he's coaching them a little bit. Here's how you talk to Trump. That is going on in every European capital right now. Everybody is being coached on how do you deal with the Trump administration. So that's no surprise. What is surprising is that Witkoff seems to view Russia as a partner. Russia is the aggressor. They're killing, they're bombing civilians deliberately. They're abducting children. It is really an awful situation. And he's viewing the United States as Russia's partner, and Ukraine as an object to be divvied up or just discussed and decided about in some way. Ukraine, of course, is a real place with real people, with real interests, and they are fighting to defend themselves against that Russian aggression. So rather than the fact of the phone calls and that kind of diplomatic exchange, what bothers me about it is the content where he is aligning the United States with Russia.
And speaking of Moscow's role in the proposal, Ms. Francis, I understand we have you back. Is it as simple as saying that these peace talks have a foundation in the Kremlin, that whatever happens with this particular document, however it is amended, that it started on a drawing board of Russian propaganda?
Well, of course, it's Russian talking points. It's very obviously that. And I think what's happened, though...
And again, it appears we unfortunately
they've sat down with Ukraine and they've come up with a counter proposal. And
I think we'll have to cut you off there. Sorry, Ms. Francis. It keeps cutting out, unfortunately. Ambassador Freed, what do you make then of Mr. Witkoff and indeed of President Putin preparing to meet again on the wishes of Donald Trump? I spoke to exiled Russian opposition leader Garry Kasparov, who basically told me the whole saga is a business deal, a blatant example of corruption. Does the Witkoff-Putin link seem to suggest that too?
Steve Witkoff is in the company of other Americans who for 80 years have thought that they could smile and glad hand the Kremlin, be chummy with them, and somehow bring the Russians or the Soviets before that to a constructive position. It doesn't work. The Russians respond to strength. They have contempt for weakness. Don't try to jolly them. Don't try to act chummy with them. They are our adversaries. They are the aggressor. Once you start speaking their language, which is toughness, then you can get somewhere. It's possible to negotiate with the Russians, but it is not possible to negotiate them with them on the basis of shared values or common interests. Negotiate with them as from a position of strength, then you can get somewhere. And Steve Witkoff is not the first, nor, I fear, is he the last American to simply not know who he's talking to.
We know Volodymyr Zelensky, Ambassador Volker, has been under pressure over this domestic bribery scandal at home. Is it a coincidence that in the same weeks that he's been facing these troubles at home, that presidents Trump and Putin decide to pump the pressure on to strike a peace deal? I mean, do they smell weakness?
Well, I think there is largely a coincidental aspect to this. That I think the dynamics that got this peace deal, proposed by, Russia and then Witkoff, it had to do with the failure of the Alaska summit. I mean, you really go back to August, and Putin promised a summit meeting with Trump. He promised, a trilateral with Trump and Zelensky, then a bilateral with Zelensky. Then he walked away from that. Then he called Trump right before Trump met Zelensky in Washington a few weeks later, and said, "Oh, okay, we'll do another summit. We'll do it in Budapest." And then Trump wanted to make sure there was going to be a deal this time, so he sends Rubio to talk to Lavrov. Well, Lavrov makes clear there is no deal, that, Russia wants what it's always wanted. So he tells this to Trump, and the Budapest summit is scrapped. Immediately after that, the Russians send Dmitriev to Florida to go talk to Witkoff. Figure, okay, Rubio's a dead end. We're not getting anything there. Let's see if we can get Witkoff to produce something that is for us. And that is what generated, I think, all of the activity we're in now. Now, at the same time, you do have this corruption scandal in Ukraine. And I think in the White House, there may have been some people that think, okay, Zelensky's weak, now's our time. But that is a complete misreading of Ukraine. The fact that there is a corruption scandal does weaken Zelensky's image domestically, meaning it is even harder for him to do something wildly unpopular, like give away Russian territory or renounce NATO membership forever or limit the size of the Ukrainian military. So there's no way he could do those things in a position of weakness, if he could do them ever at all. So I think that's a misreading on the part of the White House.
But is there an argument to be made that as part of the deal, there would be an election within 100 days and Volodymyr Zelensky would probably no longer be president, that he also could see this as an opportunity just to stop the fighting?
Well, look, again, so the idea of an election within 100 days is simply not realistic. You've got to have time to lift martial law, to have freedom of movement, to have freedom of speech, and so forth. Second, President Zelensky has already told President Trump, once there is peace and they can have an election, he will not stand, that he'll organize the election, but then step down as president. So that should no longer be a factor in people's minds. And then in terms of resetting the relationship with the United States, resetting with Russia. Yes, of course, but that's got to be on the basis of a end of fighting that is sustainable. I don't think there will ever be a peace deal with Russia because Putin will never agree to one. But I do think you can get a ceasefire and then you can get deterrence back. And if we can do that, that can create the conditions for the political refreshing of Ukraine's democracy.
Ambassador Fried, Ambassador Volker there mentioning the reintegration of Russia back into the global economy, or hinting at it. I mean, is that something that should be a positive, seen as a positive for the world, if Russia were indeed to agree to a deal that stops the fighting in Ukraine, or is that a real concern for the West?
Well, the offer to reintegrate Russia into the world economy is a nice carrot. You can dangle it in front of the Russians, but the condition should be that the Ukraine war ends and Russia observes all of its commitments under the arrangements to end that war. Let's see what happens. That's a good problem to have, but by all means, backload that concession, don't front load it. Don't give the Russians anything until they have agreed to the terms of a ceasefire, until they have withdrawn the troops from areas that they should evacuate, until they have stopped their sabotage against Europe, stopped their interference So let's feel free to offer a better relationship with Russia, but it's got to be a better behaved Russia. And this is a case where the Russians really do want something from us, and we should make them pay for it up front.
I want to end with a fundamental question for the both of you. The Yalta Agreement of 1945 split Europe into these so-called spheres of influence, pushing the East into Soviet hands, leading to decades of Cold War. Are European leaders right now fighting to stop another Yalta? I guess fighting for Europe and fighting for the world as we know it. Ambassador Fried, I'll start with you.
Ukraine's position now is far better than Poland's was in 1939 or 1945. Poland was torn apart by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And that position was made possible by the absence of the United States and the inability of Europe to help Poland. By the time you get to Yalta, it's really too late for Poland because the Soviets are in charge. A terrible situation. Ukraine's situation is much better. However, that being said, there are people in the Trump administration who are perfectly comfortable with spheres of influence. There are people who have clearly indicated that they think Ukraine in some sense belongs to Russia. It's a fatuous theory, historically blind and against U.S. interests, but they hold to it. Fortunately, they are not in command. The Trump administration is not one thing. It's really a swirling mass of competing and mutually hostile schools of thought and different strategic orientations who have their knives out for each other. This is pretty obvious. The good news is that those who believe in the free world, and I count Marco Rubio as one of them, have some latitude. So this is not a great situation, but we aren't at the place, we're not where we were in 1939 nor 1945. Thank God for that.
And Ambassador Volker, you have the last word.
Right. Well, I completely agree with Dan, but let me add a few additional points. At 1945, the world was exhausted by war, including the U.S. and its allies. Here we have a situation where Russia is nearly exhausted by war, and the United States and Europe have an economy that's 22 times the size of Russia's. We have military forces that are larger and more capable, and our equipment works. So this is not a situation where everybody is just exhausted by the end of World War II. We have a lot of leverage here, and we should be using that. As Dan was saying earlier, we should be using that to put maximum pressure on Russia to stop the war. The only reason this war continues is because Vladimir Putin continues it. Ukrainians don't want it. We don't want it. Europeans don't want it. It is about getting this dictator in Moscow to stop his aggression.
Mr. Kurt Volker, former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, and Mr. Daniel Fried, former US Ambassador to Poland. Thank you both very much for your time.
My pleasure.
And that's all for World News tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World for more. I'm Aaron Darman. Good night.